whether
inviting me and for having me. And I'll actually also be talking about a little bit about the work that I conducted together with Leonie van Gotel, who was at that point at Tilburg University. So as Sam said, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the VU, and in my PhD project we did both a lot of quantitative work, but when we were doing our quantitative work, my supervisors were very much in favour of pre-registering our work, and so was I. And then got the second phase of my project where we were supposed to do qualitative work. And my supervisor said, you should pre-register this. And then I said, I don't actually think that's relevant. I don't think it's going to be helpful. We got into a little bit of discussion, and something very similar had happened to Leonie at that point. And we met and we expressed the sort of things we were annoyed about, but it really got us thinking, you know, is there a way in which pre-registering your research can potentially be relevant for qualitative research? And that journey is what I'll be telling you about today. So a lot of, you know, discussions about open and reproducible research start with a slide similar to this one, where the main takeaway is that there are concerns about the credibility of academic science due to sort of two interrelated findings. One being concerned about an alleged reproducibility crisis, or at least concerns that scientific studies turned out to be, you know, less reproducible than really desired. And on the other hand, that we got increasing evidence closer to the sort of research integrity side of this, that researchers don't always behave as they should, and some even admit to falsify or fabricate their work. And these two findings really sparked a host of initiatives to better academic science. And one such initiative is pre-registration, and which really means that you define your research question and analysis plan prior to observing the research outcomes, and you put this on an open platform for all to see. And it's important here to keep in mind that pre-registration was really designed to improve the credibility of quantitative research. But Leonie and I, you know, wanted to stretch our hats a little bit and look beyond that fact to see if the pre-registration format could also lend itself to boost the credibility of qualitative research. So in the remainder of what I'll be telling you, I'll give a little bit more context in the form of key terms. I'll discuss a couple of objections to the idea of pre-registering qualitative research, which I go on to rebut. And then I'll briefly touch upon what we mean by strengthening credibility in qualitative research, talk about the practical usefulness, and then finally, Sam, I'll touch upon the template that we actually developed. So it would be great if you could share that link in the chat. Well, if we take pre-registration, then a very nice resource is this paper by Nosek et al., which is called the Pre-Registration Revolution. And this is how they start their paper. And they say, you know, progress in science relies in part on generating hypotheses with existing observation and testing hypotheses with new observations. And this distinction, they argue, between post-diction and prediction is appreciated conceptually, but not really respected in practice. And the important thing here is that what they try to argue is if you mistake the generation of post-dictions with testing predictions, then that indeed reduces the credibility of the findings, and that the effective solution here would be this process called pre-registration. You define your research question and analysis plan before observing the research outcomes. But what may be interesting for us here is to go a little bit deeper in what they then think about when they talk about post-diction research. And, you know, it's important to see what they sort of place the emphasis on, right? So they talk about it as a way or a means where the researcher is exploring the data to see what's possible, the observed data creating the forking paths. It helps us to generate new questions, new hypotheses. And this may already remind some of you of what qualitative research is. So very, very broadly, I would say that qualitative research aims to answer the how, the why, and the what type of questions of a phenomenon. And it tries to reveal the perspectives of the subject or the patient. And there are three, you know, very important characteristics of qualitative research. And the first is that, you know, flexibility is an invaluable asset. The researcher has the freedom to engage in a cyclic process of data collection, data analysis. So this means that some things like the number of participants or the sample are not fixed beforehand. Like if necessary, the researcher can choose to go back into the field and sample new participants when saturation has not been reached yet. And another thing is that qualitative research, as I've put it here, embraces subjectivity. And with that, I mean that the qualitative researcher typically functions as part of the measurement instrument itself and has a very great say, at least, in generating findings from the data. So during the data analysis procedure, the data are transformed into descriptions of themes, patterns, theoretical models, by means of the researcher going through several stages of data interpretation. And every result in that regard in a qualitative design is one that is an interpretation, and in that sense, subjective. And thirdly, qualitative research can be used to generate theory and hypotheses, but the can is actually very important here, because there have been recent reviews, for example, in political science, in leading political science journals, where about 40% of the qualitative research that was, reported there did say that they were explicitly testing hypotheses. So really, both are plausible. Now, there are a couple of objections to the idea of practicing qualitative research. And, the first is something like, this is just not what this was made for. So qualitative research oftentimes is not meant to test theory, make use of hypotheses that can be pre-registered at all. So this argument can be found in a paper by Humphreys et al. That claimed that their proposal to pre-register only pertains to studies that engage in hypothesis testing. And secondly, the flexibility of qualitative research that allows the researcher to react to new or unexpected findings that ask for further exploration is something that may get a lot of quantitative folks among us to raise some eyebrows. And, people may argue that if the study is so subjected to change, if even the design can change, I mean, what really do we pre-register? Is it even possible? And finally, and perhaps this is because I'm in a group where evidence-based medicine is something that we say a lot, and within evidence-based medicine, there's a lot of debate about, what counts as strong evidence. And within this, if we make sort of hierarchies of strength of evidence, then qualitative research is described as subjective, hard to replicate, anecdotal, and I've labelled this as sort of the subjectivity that qualitative researchers sometimes bring in can be perceived as scary. Now, I don't believe that this needs to disregard the merit of qualitative pre-registration altogether. And first of all, the absence of a predefined hypothesis, the first objection, may indeed disqualify pre-registration for the mere purpose of fixing expectations for testing, but it doesn't sort of disqualify it for the use of pre-registration for the purpose of, putting the study design and plan on an open platform for the scientific community to scrutinize. And regarding that switch of design, it's perfectly possible to specify a qualitative study design without disrespecting the flexibility of the study. It may just be the case that the initial design is not the same that you end up with when reporting your findings. And, this is very similar to quantitative research. Deviations are perfectly fine as long as they are thoroughly and justifiably reported. And, in addition, yes, the design may change some more times in qualitative research. Viewed this way, the demands of pre-registration are tougher for the qualitative researcher, but I don't believe they're unworkable and certainly not undesirable. And, finally, I think that by doing this pre-registration, we actually would have called to get a glimpse inside the head of a qualitative researcher, because we may learn a little bit more about how they approach the particular phenomenon and why they made certain analytical decisions along the way. And that already hints a little bit about what I mean with this credibility parallel, right? Why have I said at the beginning that I think that pre-registration may strengthen the credibility of qualitative work? And, in the quantitative field, we say, pre-registration makes the stuff more credible if, fellows, like people that are also in your field, would agree that your suggested analyses are correct. They would agree with them. They would also say that, the conclusions you're presenting are indeed convincing given the sort of analyses you have done. And here we follow Eisner, who talks about credibility in qualitative work. And he says, we seek a confluence of evidence that breeds credibility, that allows us to feel confident about our observations, interpretations, and conclusions. And he says, ideally, this would lead to an agreement among competent others that the description, evaluation, and thematics are right. And I want to stress here that credibility is not an underrated term in qualitative research, but I hope you do sort of see the parallel that I've presented here. And finally, it's a little bit closer to the talk we actually saw before about, doing meta-analysis or evidence synthesis. There are two ways where I think this can be practically useful to pre-register your work. First, because it may help combat dissemination bias. This is when, the findings from a qualitative research study are not spread and consequently, of course, not accessible. And second, it could, it could be an incentive to very strictly report on your study. And this is actually something that people have already reported when trying out similar things like the audit trail, which was one proposed by Lincoln and Guba. And, people that have engaged in this have reported in interviews, like, I do feel more confident. I felt that I got a better grasp of my data because I had to do all of this. So that's what we concluded on. This is the abstract that you see from the paper I just presented. And I think what's really important is to flash that we concluded, hey, this can be meaningful, but the form itself is really subject to large modifications. And that's what I've been working on together with this team of people that, for the sake of time, I'll skip a little bit and talk about them. But I think it's important here to score that, I've already argued that it may, and so have some of these people's, pre-registration may strengthen the credibility and transparency of qualitative research. And that over the years, we've seen the importance of pre-registration being recognised by more and more stakeholders. So here I'm thinking about funders that now require their work to be pre-registered, what they fund, but also, disciplinary organisations. And as I said, different authors, including myself, have put forth ideas, but that be no involvement with the community whom these ideas were supposed to serve. So what has just been accepted had as a real goal to, understand what parts of the pre-registration template qualitative researchers would find helpful and informative. And we did so by means of a Delphi study, which just in a nutshell is a series of questionnaires with feedback reports in between. And it's, you can reach out, as you can with surveys, to an otherwise dispersed group. And the idea is, in relation to other consensus making methods, there's not one person that can really dominate because it's all online. And you can see our design in this flowchart here. I'm actually going to ask Sam how much time I have left. Just thinking about what sort of details.
Plenty.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to eat up Katie's time, namely. So then I'll say a little bit more about who was included in this study. So we put together a pool of potential panelists using a four-fold strategy. I asked the steering committee members for this project, a lot of whom were working in qualitative research themselves, to put forward suitable colleagues. We approached the authors of all the reporting guidelines that could be found on Equator. So I'm yet promoting Iona's message here again. And we also recruited what I've labeled here active qualitative research. And with that, I meant that we did a very broad search in Scopus and Web of Science, and we tried to dig out those authors that had published at least 4 papers within the last 5 years using qualitative research methodology. And finally, people could suggest colleagues, which led to a total pool of 294 people being invited. We created the first questionnaire also having a four-fold approach. I synthesized all the existing work by the steering committee members on this. We did a systematic search looking for qualitative research, pre-registration. We screened the 21 existing reporting guidelines on Equator, and the correct was already on the slide. And I also hand searched additional reporting guidelines like a JAS for EPA. And this together led to 36 proposals for items to include in a pre-registration template, and that's arguably a lot. So we discussed this among the steering committee member, and we thought, we really tried to sort of merge items that were tapping into highly similar issues, which led to the final 21 proposals. So Delphi consists of 2 rounds, and I thought that it would be nice to show you what that looked like. So here on this slide, on the sort of lower row, if you will, you can see the initial term. So in our first questionnaire, we talked about something that we labeled sampling strategy. And then the little windows that you can see above are the comments that we got from various panelists. And I've here made bold which part we then used from those comments to improve. So in our second attempt, in the second questionnaire, when we worked all the feedback, we called it case selection strategy. And then again, we got a bunch of comments from a panelist being like, no, you've confused two matters here. You should actually separate those. You might still want to include these people. There is some way in which the term sampling does resonate with people. So that led to our final term being sampling case selection strategy. Now, wrapping up, we developed an agreement-based form for pre-registered qualitative research. And I think it's really important here that I stress that the strength of qualitative research, which is precisely its ability to adapt and adjust or respond to what has been found, is not lost in pre-registration and need not be, because I believe this pre-registration is ultimately a plan and not a prison. I also want to emphasize that the use of this form is voluntary and that it should provide a systematic starting point, so it really needs to be updated. An agreement-based form is, of course, not the best form for every unique study or for even every type of qualitative work. So we would warmly encourage scholars to produce or to create what we call here extra modules that may be relevant for their type of inquiry, but not for all. And finally, I want to say there's, of course, at this point, no empirical evidence to suggest that pre-registering your qualitative work would lead to better study quality. However, we define that. And I think that we're currently really looking for good examples for people that may want to take up this practice. So as some final next steps, the form that I just presented is now available on the Open Science Framework. You can find it here on the menu. And I want to thank all the panel members that have taken part in my Delphi, and thank you to all of you for listening.